Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar, the 2016 Year in Review. I'm your host, Allison Crawford. 2016 has meant huge changes for supply chain. In this retrospective webinar, we'll review the last 12 months of research against market trends to glean what 2016 brought us and what we can expect from 2017. Today we're going to talk with 3 experts and hear your thoughts on this topic. But before I hand this over to your speakers, there are a few things I want to cover with you. First, we're recording today's session and we'll post it on our on-demand webinar page. You can visit our website to listen to this or any of our other webinars. Additionally, we'll send out the slides to all attendees within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. We encourage you to share these slides with others in your organization, and if you have questions, reach out to Laura to set up a private discussion. We also want to hear your questions about our findings. Please post the Q&A or chat function to the left of your screen. We've left time at the end of the webinar to address all of your questions. And finally, we will be live tweeting the webinar, so if you'd like to join in the social media conversation, you can use the hashtag SCIWebinar and the Twitter handle at SCI Insights LLC during the event. With that, let me introduce your speakers. We're joined by Vice President of Thought Leadership Trevor Miles, who serves as an expert source both internally for Connexus as well as for customers, prospects, industry analysts, and journalists. Known throughout the supply chain field, he has published many articles, presented at various industry events, and is the primary contributor to the Connexus 21st Century Supply Chain blog. Trevor helps Connexus seek new market opportunities within the company's distinctive competence and is instrumental in the company's competitive and market intelligence, guiding the overall market positioning and priorities for rapid response. Having lived, worked, and studied in Canada, the United States, Europe, and Africa, Trevor brings a global perspective to market needs and customer requirements. Prior to joining Connexus, Trevor worked for I2 Technologies, where he held a number of sales and marketing roles and worked with global industry leaders such as Continental, Volkswagen, Nokia, and Thomson. Previous to I2, he worked for Coopers & Lybrand, performing several studies in supply chain reengineering for companies such as Levi's, Burma Oil, TNT Logistics, AGA Gas, and Schneider Electric, among others. Trevor has degrees in chemical engineering and industrial engineering. We're also joined by Roddy Martin, Vice President, Supply Chain Management, Product Marketing, and Supply Chain Transformation Thought Leadership at Oracle. Roddy has 35 years engineering, manufacturing, and supply chain operations, leadership, and consulting experience across many organizations. He's held roles at SA Consulting Engineering, SAB Miller, Supply Chain Research at AMR Research, Managing Director at Accenture, and a Supply Chain Thought Leader at Donata. His specialties include topics such as transformation, supply chain product strategies, especially cloud and impact of digitization, business, manufacturing, and supply chain strategy development, operationalizing demand-driven strategies, and manufacturing, supply chain, and change leadership consulting. Finally, we're joined by Laura Cesari, founder of Supply Chain Insights. Laura has spent 9 years as an industry analyst with Gartner Group, AMR Research, and Altimeter Group, 10 years as a leader in the building of supply chain software at Manugistics and Descartes Systems Group, and 15 years as a supply chain practitioner at Procter & Gamble, Kraft General Foods, Clorox, and Dreyer's brand ice cream, which is now a division of Nestle. She founded Supply Chain Insights in 2012 to bring a new perspective to supply chain research and client advisory. As an enterprise strategist, Laura focuses on the changing face of enterprise technologies, and her research is designed for the early adopters seeking first-mover advantage. So, Laura, we have a very distinguished panel today, so without further ado, let me hand this over to you.
Thank you, Allison, and this is always one of my very favorite webinars. We do this at the end of every year where we actually are reviewing the research from the prior year. And as we do this, I invite a panel to actually give me their feedback on the research, because on an ongoing basis at Supply Chain Insights, we ask for feedback on the research. So our studies this year were focused on horizontal processes, customer-centric supply chains, analytics, network of networks, direct materials, and then we're going to go through some significant findings, and then we're going to wrap up the conference. So as we look at the horizontal processes, what we have is that many companies have given us feedback that the horizontal processes are evolving, coming out from S&OP. 94% of companies have an S&OP process. 56% of the companies say it's effective. 90% say they have a demand management process. 44% say it's effective. Fewer companies have revenue management, and fewer companies have supplier development. And in the research, we were testing to find out what percentage of companies actually see these horizontal processes as linking across demand, supply, and product. And that was about 10% of companies are actually looking at the linkage of these horizontal processes. So Trevor, your thoughts here, does that surprise you at all?
No, not really, Laura. And the key thing that I always look at is, what's missing here? Is it the process? Is it technology? Is it structure, organizational structure? I'm always fascinated by which of these is the biggest gap. And when I look at S&OP in particular, that's a process that was designed in the past. It was designed by Dick Ling, I think 79 or something like that. So if you think about all of the technology changes that have taken place between now and then, there's a huge gap between what was designed to work in a very analog environment to now in a digital world. And really, the essence is people couldn't analyze sufficient quantities of data. They had very disparate structures and organizations, and they wanted to bring all of those things together. That's the essence of S&OP. And really the recommendation for anybody listening to the webinar would actually be to merge that planning and execution and planning at different layers because after all, these things are all interlinked. And I think this is the primary gap that we're looking at here, because if we look at all of these separations between the process and the effectiveness, it comes down to the fact that we're dealing with each of these in isolation and not bringing them all together, or looking at them as separate activities as opposed to a contiguous whole. And that's what I mean by bringing in planning and execution into one. That would be my recommendation here.
Roddy, your thoughts here? Thank you, Trevor.
Yeah, Laura, it's interesting when you look at process design versus effectiveness of the process. I think it tells a story. I think there is enough domain expertise and functional expertise in most organizations to design a process, a horizontal process. The question is, why is it not effective? And there is even a story within the different processes, right? So revenue management, which is much harder, is harder to be effective, whereas demand management is kind of more intuitive to a supply chain organization. I was a little surprised by supplier. Now, so the bottom line is we've designed these processes, but something is not connecting to make these processes effective. You've heard many times my whole 5-stage maturity model that I love to refer to, because the reality is the 10% sort of represents those companies whose leadership teams have figured out what demand-driven really means and what outside in really means versus inside out. And so the bottom line is, if you look at the 5 stages of maturity, most companies are still in stage 2, stage 3, which means they think about performance improvement in projects or in functional silos. They think about it in terms of functional excellence. There are very few companies who take the cue from a leading CPG company who, way back when all of this started, said, we design our supply chain end-to-end from the buyer back to supply. And that was very advanced thinking for the time. So I am surprised but not surprised that we've done a reasonable job of mapping processes out. What I'm not surprised about, is simply because I interact with so many supply chain leaders, is that those processes are not yet effective because the alignment and the leadership from the supply chain organization is still not there. What are we going to do differently? We all know, Nick Delaney very well, chairman of VTech, and he made such a true statement to me the other day. He said, supply chain's a really hard job, and it's much more than software. So I think we can go up the wazoo, integrating data, integrating applications, but until we actually figured out what behaviors we need to drive and lead in a business, those processes are going to stay ineffective. And it's because people, process, and technology are just not being brought together.
Well, and that whole leadership issue about bringing it together, I think, is, an issue. Now, in parallel, I have never seen more what I consider to be exciting technology evolve in the market. You know, the open source code, cognitive analytics, Internet of Things, robotics. But when we look at companies' approach to trying new technology, we find that we have 3 times the number of late adopters to early adopters. And this was surprising to me, Roddy. When you and I worked together at AMR Research in 2006, we did a similar study. I don't know if you remember it, but it was a bell curve. So we had an equal number of early adopters with late adopters. Does this surprise you, and what do you think is driving it?
Look, there's caution. There's no doubt that companies are cautious. I mean, business leaders are confronted with massive change, right? Globalization, mergers and acquisitions. It's maybe more intense than what it's ever been. But I think those companies who figured out what it means to be demand-driven and what outside-in behaviors really look like are the ones that will much, much more quickly see the benefits of all these new technologies. It's no good rushing out. You know, if you're a stage 2, stage 3 functional excellence, project excellence organization, rushing out and buying, you know, advanced analytics and big data and deploying IoT when really you're still looking for a problem to solve. You know, we saw that in the days of RFID. For how long did we not see all the flurry of activity around RFID? But only recently are you seeing companies like Delta Airlines use it to track baggage, etc. So I don't think that we've done a good enough job to the laggards to help them understand what demand-driven really means, what good looks like, and how to change behaviors. And those companies that are leaning first are the companies that have really got strong leaders who know what problem they're trying to solve.
Trevor, how about your thoughts? Why are we seeing more conservatism?
Yeah, so it is that change that I find interesting, Laura, because as you say, a couple of years ago it was more of a bell curve, and now it seems to be more of a skew towards the laggard side of things. I think there is some level of fatigue in organizations, but at the same time, I'm not sure that the bell curve isn't relevant in other areas. For example, I'd say that largely the business people understand what cloud means right now. They might not understand what it means technically, but they must certainly understand what it means in terms of opportunity to change process and get access to information more quickly, et cetera, and translate that into business value. But some of the newer terminology, machine learning, artificial intelligence, blockchain, I think those are areas where there's actually very little knowledge in the business community about what they mean and what the opportunity is. And really my recommendation there would be to go out and explore. It doesn't cost much to actually sit into webinars. You've run some. There are other people who have run webinars who are actually talking about what this actually means in terms of business change, translating that back into supply chain, and then setting up some small projects to get a body of knowledge inside of the organizations, because these are going to transform the manner in which we operate. And anybody who sticks in the laggard environment is going to find it very difficult to adopt later, because the challenge at a later stage is only going to be greater. Whereas if they build some level of center of excellence right now and get some knowledge of the capabilities and needs, and from there start developing use cases, I think they'll get ahead of the game and be able to demonstrate to the rest of the organization where the value lies. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, can I challenge Trevor a little, because I think the business is a big place, and the business as we know it is business people, operations people, and IT. And I think that IT has a reasonable understanding of what cloud is all about. Just remember, we've taken many businesses down a 15-year roadmap of spending billions in some cases on whatever systems, ERP, supply chain systems. And the business is cautious, because there's no secret to the fact that many of those business leaders will say, well, I'm not so sure whether I really got all the value that I thought I was going to get. And so, I've got more important funds, I've got more important expenditures and things to worry about in terms of my business's capabilities going forward. So, you know what? Yes, this demand-driven thing is fine. I agree with it, and I've had many business executives say that to me. But the making of the change, the sticking the business on the line and say you're going to flip this whole business around and start reading demand and sensing demand and then responding to demand out the supply system, that's a big change. And until we can make the business more comfortable at that change, I think we're going to see ongoing caution.
I think...
Go on, Laura.
I think both are happening. I see organizations that are cautious, but I also see some of these early adopters doing what Trevor's talking about building sandboxes and testing new technologies. And I just think it's ironic that in my experience of 15 years as an analyst, I've never seen more exciting technologies come into the supply chain space, but yet I've never seen more caution. So, and I do think we're on the edge of redefining decision support and redefining analytics. And so I think that it's an important discussion of how do we get some innovation happening in the process areas and the technology areas for all organizations to be having, and also coming to grips with where are they on this curve. Sometimes people don't move with their cultural DNA. Maybe they'll adopt things too quickly. So I think it's interesting, but let's move on. So one of the things that we did during the year was we tested descriptors, and we did this in a number of studies where we looked at how do people describe their supply chains. And 1/3 of companies thought that the supply chain was traditional and tactical and cautious, but noticed that about 1/3 of companies thought that there was great room for improvement, and about 1/3 thought it was working well. But down here where we look at why do they want it to be improved, it's really push for agility and proactivity and alignment. Now, when we tested the room for improvement versus working well, we found 5 characteristics that were significant at a 90% confidence level. One is the executive level of understanding. 2 was supply chain visibility. 3rd was organizational change management. Cross-functional alignment, which we've had a lot of fun measuring. And then 5 was the ability to use data. Now, the way to read this chart is we're looking at the gap analysis. So the red represents those that feel like there's room for great improvement, and blue looks at where they're working well. And this is the gap chart. So in the working well, there is a much lower gap on each of these factors. So, Roddy, why don't you go first? How do you feel about this, and is there anything here that surprises you?
Well, what I like to look at is the little clear box in the center, which is effectively the gap, right? So where are the biggest gaps? The biggest gaps are 25% in alignment and 25% in using data. Where is the least gap? Well, the least gap is understanding of the supply chain, because I think we've hammered home the idea of end-to-end, outside-in, and I think a lot of business executives intuitively get it. The problem is, what do you do about changing the behaviors of the business when you actually understand it? So I'm not surprised by this at all. I would have thought and expected organization change to be a much bigger gap than what it is, than 18%. The understanding, visibility, nothing surprises me, but ability to use data and cross-functional alignment are the big red flags to me. I mean, you wrote a good book called Metrics Matter, and you spelled out all the metrics in the horizontal end-to-end supply chain. Why did companies not just intuitively take those metrics and institute them as the way they manage performance? Well, the reality is that's a huge step when, as a leadership team, you're still being measured on very traditional supply chain measures.
So I'm going to come back to you, Roddy, and have you say what do people do about it. But Trevor, your thoughts here?
Well, I can't help but be struck by the fact that the top pain points are all pointing to the same issue, the disconnect between data, people, and process. So if you put organizational change in the middle as that thing that results from needing to connect the data, connect the people, and connect the process, which is really the ability to access and use data, supply chain visibility, and cross-functional alignment, you can put exactly the data, process, and people into those categories. The real question in terms of what we would recommend and look at this is, I might be at cross purposes with Roddy here, but recently I saw a senior VP of a toy company present at a conference. And his suggestion to everybody in the audience, and most of these people were VPs and above of supply chain in an audience of about 100 people. He said, the word transformation is scary to anybody. The best thing to do is to actually change the metrics, and the behavior will change with it. Now, it's easy for somebody to stand up at a conference and make these statements, but nevertheless, it struck home with me that, in fact, sometimes when we go in and say, oh, you're going to have to change, very few people are actually willing to do that. But if you go to them and say, oh, this is what I would like you to focus on, then inevitably they will focus on that, and the behavior that you're looking for will be a result of that. So when I'm looking at this, one of the biggest things I see in many organizations is they don't have access to the information. And when they make a decision, they don't know the impact they have on the rest of the organization. So then how can you get to cross-functional alignment when I don't know what impact I'm having on you? So that's one key thing, but that all stems from having that supply chain visibility so that when you make a change in demand, you know what the supply impact is. You make a change in inventory, you know what the demand impact is. So it is about bringing all of those things together, and I think ultimately then it's about what I've heard one person refer to as the network planner, who has visibility and access to all of this information, and that is how you get that organizational change and close those gaps. That would be my recommendation for 2017.
Yeah. And I also see, Trevor, that when companies have a guiding coalition, so something major is happening.
Yes.
I worked with a pharmaceutical company that wanted to save enough for a new drug, and I worked with another company that had huge write-offs and they wanted to prevent it. It's sort of when you've got a leadership change in that guiding coalition that I think you start to see this align. Roddy, your thoughts on what would you do to get this gap to close?
Right. Well, so there's two very clear thrusts in the slide. The left-hand side will follow the right-hand side. And to take a leaf out of I think one of the better supply chain female leaders in the world, she's busy building the capability in the leadership team to align across the functions and to understand through that alignment what data and information they need, and then to build the capabilities through change management. So I'm going to tag on to your guiding coalition, and I think it's much stronger than a guiding coalition because I think it's a CEO-level led initiative that paints a picture, whether it's based on a crisis or a beachhead opportunity in the marketplace, but building that guiding coalition, getting that alignment, and then translating it back to the understanding and visibility. Because the two left-hand side ones will follow if you get the three right-hand side ones right. But that doesn't work the other way around. You can't have the visibility and understanding if you don't have alignment across the leadership team.
So
that's
Ahmed
my recommendation.
Yeah, I think that's right. Ahmed asked, well, what does working well mean? And that actually ties into the next research slide. So, lots of people talk about supply chain excellence, or they'll talk about working well. And we were looking at the attributes, but we decided to test 65 different variables against different objective functions. And the one I'm going to give you now is price to tangible book. So we did a lot of work over the year of looking at market price to book value, market price to market capitalization, and we actually tested 65 factors to be able to see in the research which factors were actually driving improvement in market value. And most supply chains have been on a cost driven agenda, and value is something that people say they want to move to, but there's no definition of value. We did about a year of research, and we sit on 15 years of market data, and we actually picked market value as price to tangible book. And the 65 factors that we tested things like a common ERP instance. We tested, how was the organization structured. And we actually found 4 items to have a fairly low correlation, but they did have some correlation, and we were talking to some statistics professors who said that, in the social sciences that they think that this is relevant. So one of the things that we found that did have some relationship was an effective center of excellence. We did not find that strategy had a correlation, but we found that center of excellence had a correlation. And that was because I think the center of excellence will actually tie strategy to execution. Interestingly, over 50% of centers of excellence fail. And we did a lot of research on what is an effective center of excellence, which is available on our website. The other factor which had a correlation was sales and operations planning effectiveness, and I also showed you that effectiveness of S&OP is like the flip of a coin. But if the company felt that S&OP was effective, there was balance between the commercial teams and the operations teams, and that they were able to drive against a shared goal, then that had a correlation. The third factor was second and third tier supplier visibility, which shocked me a little bit, but then when I thought about it, if you are really aggressive about building visibility, you will have, more second and third tier visibility. So it's a condition of the maturity of visibility processes. And then the fourth, which was a negative correlation, was pain with supplier reliability. If the suppliers were a major factor with the degradation in reliability, then there was a negative correlation. Now, this is different than, the attribute-based analysis, but I do think there's some parallels. Trevor, your thoughts here?
Yes, I think much of it points to a lot of what we've been talking about right now, Laura, which is the connectivity across the network, because the suppliers are obviously external partners. We work with many companies, and I think Roddy does, and everybody else. But large conglomerations often look like an entire ecosystem, and in many cases have grown through acquisition and have different cultures in different pockets of the organization and even different areas. But they just happen to be managed by the same corporate entity. And, if we look at the behaviors in those organizations, it's not much different from behaviors in organizations that are owned by different corporate entities. And it is this capability of actually bringing that decision layer across those organizational boundaries, so that the center of excellence is really driving the capability of people to actually work together, of actually describing the value that actually is coming out of the closer cooperation between the trading partners. Because if you don't have that, this then means that you don't have that second and third tier supply visibility, and you're going to have the pain with supplier reliability because you don't have the relationships, you don't have the speed of information, you don't have the speed of communication, and therefore all of these other things are going to fall apart. So I think even these results point to the same issues that we've highlighted in other areas about this inability of the organization to use the data to connect the processes and therefore connect the people into a seamless decision environment. That would be my observation, Laura.
Yeah, Roddy, your thoughts?
Well, what's interesting is these four map to the right-hand side of the previous slide, right?
Right.
And my pet peeve is that when you hear companies talk about center of excellence, they're generally talking about a project management office. They're not talking about a place where the business is designing its future operating model and there's change management at play. And so where do you see that manifest? You see it manifest in S&OP, because in S&OP, if you have misaligned goals between supply and demand, and you're not just chasing balancing supply and demand, but you're really driving the whole concept of organizational effectiveness and demand driven. That's why S&OP in its traditional sense is just not good enough. I mean, think about what one consumer company calls this their capability or their capacity gaps, because that's effectively what S&OP is all about. And then if you look at supplier visibility and supplier reliability, that's the other side of the equation. So I think that these four map very clearly to the right-hand side three of the previous graph, and it points to alignment, change management, and a clear vision of what you're trying to achieve. The two on the left will come if you get the three on the right.
Yeah.
Now, Jason asked, yep, go ahead, Trevor.
Can I bring up an anecdote, because I think it really relates to all of this. And this, I've only seen one company that's done this. It is a large CPG company, but I think it points to the future, organizational structure change, et cetera. There's a person who's 45 years old, roughly that age, below whom I cannot tell who is business and who is IT. And these people are constantly flowing from one side of the fence to the other, as it were. And when you walk into a meeting, even from the titles, I can't tell who's who. But above that 45-year-old, there's a very clear distinction as to who's business and IT, and they've always been either business or IT throughout their careers. And I think this is really talking to this future environment where people are going to have the skill to navigate around these different capabilities. If you think about it, it wasn't long ago, and I'm one of those who had to learn how to use a word processor. Whereas in this day and age, you wouldn't dream of anybody coming out of a high school without a capability of using word processing. And you don't have to go to classes to learn it. It's just something that happens. And I think this is pointing to the structural changes that technology is going to bring in organizations. And this is where, the center of excellence, the visibility, all of this capability is going to emerge from organizations. But we shouldn't be looking top-down for this emergence, in my opinion. We should be looking bottom-up. We should be identifying those young leaders who are comfortable in either area of the business and promote them, because they understand the value of technology to business, and they understand the business needs to translate it into technology. And that's the skill I think is coming through with the younger generation.
Yeah, Laura, if I can just...
Hang on, Jason. Okay, Roddy.
No, I was just going to say, Trevor, I think it's bottom up and top down, because we see so many of these things come unstuck because they are driven bottom up. And I think a lot of that caution is because so much of it is bottom up without the understanding of top down.
Fair enough.
So Jason asked the question if there were differences that we saw in the structure of the organization or the focus, whether they were project-based or process. And we tested for that. We tested different organizational models. We tested discrete and process. And we really did not see a difference there. Originally, I had some hypothesis around organizational structure that did not actually correlate. Now, this is social, analysis, and it's more difficult, but we did not actually find that. Now, one of the things that we actually focused on was customer-centric supply chain. A lot of times people will say that they want to have a customer-centric supply chain, and I'll usually sit back and I'll laugh and I'll say, what do you mean a customer-centric supply chain? And in this research, we built this infographic that, 80% said that they had a strategy to be customer-centric, but 46% actually felt that they were making any progress. And so, they had some pitfalls, doing whatever the customer wants, confusing that with being customer-centric, not being clear on who the customer is, mismanaging the complexity of the supply chain. And then, the recommendations from this research, which there's a report on this, is, really understand the moments of truth and what is needed at the node of the channel when we're actually moving goods, and then test what matters to customers and drive alignment, and then use both channel and customer data. Now, one of the things that I think that people are not clear about is, we use the term outside-in, demand-driven, customer-centric, and we built this model out of this research that looks at different things that people can do. And, what is the definition of an outside-in process, and what is the outside-in definition of demand-driven, and how does demand-driven actually intersect with customer-centric? And one of the things I think that is important here is being really clear on outcomes and being clear on terminology. Roddy, your thoughts here?
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, what does outside-in change and what is demand-driven change? And I think, there was a great Harvard article many years back that said, follow a customer order. We could say follow demand and walk back to supply. And that's not how most companies operate. Most companies are trying to fill plants. They're trying to integrate acquisitions on a global basis, build a global supply chain, lean out the capabilities and the processes. But what they're not doing is translating these. What behaviors does customer-centric drive? What behaviors what does outside in mean? What trade-offs do you make when you say you're outside in? And that's why those leaders who get it and who quickly ramp into this transformation initiative, they have a good understanding of what these terms mean in terms of different behaviors. So I think we all need to do a better job of helping the leadership team in the business understand what has to stop and what has to start if we talk outside in, demand-driven, and customer-centric. So my recommendation is this goes back to leadership alignment.
Trevor, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm stuck on the recommendation one of the three recommendations. Get clear on what each node of the channel values. I would say turn it around and how they get measured, because what I observe is that all too often we have a kumbaya meeting at the more senior level, and then what happens is that the measures by which people are actually acting are inconsistent with what the overall objectives are of the organization and what the senior level has set. Now, where the problem lies, I don't really know, but what happens is once you get down into the transactional level, it is then a buy-sell relationship with everybody trying to maximize their particular objective, particularly, piece price at a cost level or something like that. So we get lost in that overall relationship, or that overall relationship gets lost in the transactional detail because the metrics by which people are measured are not consistent with the overall objectives, which really gets back to that earlier statement I was making about the senior executive. Is that change the metric and the behavior will come with it. But that does get back to Roddy's point of if you do get the senior alignment, but then sit down and translate that into what is the behavior we want to see on the ground, and how are we going to measure to actually ensure that that behavior is consistent with our overall objectives. That's the step I find missing in most organizations.
Yep, let's shift gears. Now, one of the things we started working on this year was the network of networks. And Trevor, you've actually been a participant in this. And what we're trying to do is look at how do we build business to business and redefine it so that it can be many to many. It can allow us to adopt flows across organizations. And we're actually proposing to do a series of tests across companies, and we have a call for action to test blockchain of distributed processing, artificial intelligence, distributed massive parallel processing, and streaming data. And Schneider Electric is actually going to let us use their digital sand and their sandboxes to test this. And EDA Open and Alemica have agreed to test along with Schneider, and we're looking for other people to test. Then, we talked about some use cases, and the group decided that the first use case is to test our community directory and interoperability. How do you feel about this work, Trevor?
Yeah, it really is pointing to the future, Laura, because when I observe, and in fact I saw one chemical company present at one of your conferences, in which the leader stood up and said that one of their difficulties is that they have 4 different logistics providers because each of them is specialized in road and rail and air and whatever, sea. And as a consequence, they needed to do 3 levels of integration, and this was an absolute nightmare and absorbed a huge amount of the time and cost. So being able to reduce that effort, not just for the initial deployment, but the ongoing maintenance of that data, and providing that much less friction-focused structure where the data becomes part of the whole decision process. I learned last time was schema and read, so that you actually can translate what the information is, because it contains some information that tells you what it is actually, what it means. So all of this is really important, and the ideas that you've sort of outlined here, the traceability, the supply chain and finance, and interoperability are key aspects that I think everybody coalesced to in the meeting, because it's whether it's internal to large organizations or external between trading partners, the data is the glue, the data is the new oil, as it were, but we've got to find ways of mining that data more quickly. And these are all activities that are focused on reducing the time it takes to get value out of that data.
So, as part of the research will be to actually test some use cases and then try to drive a driving coalition to try to redefine B2B, because we're stuck, We can't connect people very quickly on multi-tier, many-to-many architectures. Roddy, what do you think of this work?
Well, and I'm going to sound like a bit of a stuck record, because when the business knows what performance it's trying to achieve and the leadership team is aligned, they know what information they need to make the right trade-offs. Now, the point is, how efficiently are we getting that data, processing that data, and making trade-offs? And I think that's where the big opportunity lies. So can we trace bad data? Can we relate it to supply chain finance? Can we use that data to actually get functions to work more closely and collaborate more closely, even outside the organization? I mean, I recently went through a mapping out of the end-to-end product value chain in a pharmaceutical company, everything from the molecule to the commercial insert in a market. And all of the teams were convinced that they didn't need to work together until we'd gone through the whole day, and everyone said, wow, it is actually one product value chain. We now have a much better understanding of how to collaborate. So my recommendation goes back to the point of make sure we know what it is that we're trying to achieve. Make sure the leadership team is aligned and it knows behaviorally what trade-offs they need to make. Then let's isolate the data and see whether we can do a better job of analyzing that data. And, maybe we've overplayed big data, maybe we've underplayed the Internet of Things, but we need to figure out what are the technology enablers to get the business to collaborate more effectively inside and outside.
Well, thank you for being part of our panel today. When you think about this research, what really speaks to you, Trevor?
Yeah, Laura, I do want to bring one little anecdote up here, because I think it is really important in bringing this all together. And in fact, Roddy and I were both in this meeting where a woman in strategy in one of the pharmaceutical companies stood up and said that she was sick and tired of the 60-year-old white men who were, stuck in their ways. And, I'm one of those now, and, it sort of gave me pause for reflection, because what she said afterwards was really important, was that she'd gone to one of the top MBA schools and said, give me 14 of your brightest, and I'm going to give them lots of money to work for us for a short period of time, for 3 months. And she asked them to follow these senior people for 6 weeks to find out what decisions they were trying to make on a daily basis. And then in the next 6 weeks, show them that, in fact, if they had the skills and capabilities, they could make those decisions themselves. And in fact, there was quite a large change in the organizational structure as a result of that project, which really comes down to the heart of, I think, a lot of what we were talking about today, is the fact that people are working in disparate islands, but nevertheless, there is this body of skill that's coming through that is actually able to utilize that information, but bringing that information together in a more consistent manner is going to make it a lot more usable to everybody. But you still need to have the skills and knowledge and understanding of what the value is of that information to use it most effectively. So this is where I think there's going to be a lot of confluence of the capabilities needed to drive the organization. And it comes back, in my opinion, to having the connected data, having the connected processes, as Roddy was just talking about, walking through that pharmaceutical organization, and then having the people, because people are still going to be central to the organization, but learning how to collaborate and share the information across those different organizational boundaries is absolutely key for us to be able to drive it, whether that's internal or whether that's external, whether that's having machine learning, helping people actually make those decisions on a more massive scale across different decision trees is irrelevant to the fact that this is all pointing to the future. Okay?
Roddy, your thoughts?
Laura, what I'm pleased to see, and I'm going to go back to that what is working well bar graph. What I'm pleased to see is that you're actually highlighting the right three, and not at the expense of the left two, but highlighting the right three, because I think that the analyst and the consulting world has looked at the right three in a very fragmented way. And in my opinion, it's the leading indicator of change and transformation. Every company that I've been in, without fail, that I think is doing a great job of supply chain was because the leaders get it, the leaders are aligned, they realize and they've measured what it is that they're trying to achieve with the business. And so that's what I'm really thrilled about. And in terms of, so what would my recommendation be? I think that there is a huge opportunity for leaders, and I've seen this happen in many cases, leaders building that guiding coalition, but much stronger than just the traditional sense of the word guiding coalition or project management office, and making sure that they are, here's the key, defining the capabilities that the business needs to have to operate as a outside-in demand-driven supply chain. And when they get that right, what does that mean? How do leaders behave differently? What kind of talent do we need? What kind of systems do we need? I think that's where we're going to see much more of that, or much less of the 10% that are so cautious.
Yeah. Now, every year we have a conference where we challenge and try to build training and try to challenge people to think about process innovation. And we actually have a couple of questions about, one's on Uberization and the supply chain. And at our conference last year, we talked about the collaborative economy and sharing of autonomous vehicles in digital agriculture, or the autonomous vehicle revolution that's going to happen and what that's going to do to trucking. But, one of the things that I don't think people are thinking about enough is process innovation. We have product stage gates, but I don't think we're really asking ourselves, what could we do differently with these technologies? Last year we had a person talk about the redefinition of service using the Internet of Things and sensors, and saying, instead of scheduling an appointment and waiting for 5 hours while our serviceman didn't come, could they knock on the front door and tell somebody that their air conditioner unit was getting ready to fail? Or we had a presentation on Internet of Things and replenishment. Should demand be really forecasted based upon history, or should we use Internet of Things? And we had a coffee shop talk about using the barista signal as an automatic output for forecasting. And so as we think about, people conveniently say the Uberization of supply chain, I think we have to think about new ways of serving customers and using the technology differently. And one of the things we try to showcase at this conference is that kind of tipping point. But I think one of the issues is that in organizations today, people struggle to do process innovation. I don't know, Trevor, I know you were there. Your thoughts
Yes, so this is, I think, the central point I've been trying to drive, Laura, because when I think about a leader, I'm not thinking seniority. So my one caution to Roddy is the person in power is not necessarily the one who's going to lead the organization to the next stage of capability, and it is those that do understand and can translate the capabilities of the technology into business objectives. And exactly as you're saying, Laura, that often comes with a process change. We didn't always do things as we do them today. We know that the Industrial Revolution had a major change in how people did things. We know that the assembly line had a drastic impact on the way in which we manufactured our products. So there are these innovation and process changes, because I want to emphasize those two things because that was your emphasis too. The technology has to be followed with the process because that's how you get most value out of that technology. So, Henry Ford watching the meat packers slice apart carcasses said, well, why don't I reverse this process? But he couldn't, of course, now neatly go and put hooks in the ceiling. He had to do different ways of actually enabling that process, which is where the technology comes in, which led to all sorts of other changes in the manner in which the components were manufactured. So process has to be part of that. But it's the people, the leaders who actually understand what that all means and what the opportunity is are the ones who are going to need to drive it. And I don't think we should be looking just at the people in most senior positions for that leadership.
Well, and Trevor, one of the issues is I think we try to take these new technologies and we try to make our old processes more efficient versus looking at what could these processes be, right? And I think the ideation around these processes, I was in Nigeria, and they had actually used collaborative economy and the Uber kind of concepts to share implements and use M-Pesa for currency. And I'm like, I love it. Let's disintermediate banks and let's do more sharing of economy and let's, use more of Internet of Things. Roddy, your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think on the innovation front, and Trevor, I'm certainly not implying that it's always the CEO, right? But the point is, you've got to take somebody to lead innovation that's not encumbered by projects and by functional excellence. I often, I've seen in cases, and I've more often than not seen innovation initiatives fail simply because the people or person leading it was so bogged down in other stuff. And so, it's a special breed of individual who can look across the end-to-end business and see the big opportunity areas, and then has the power of influence to work with the leadership team or the team below them, right? It depends on where they sit in the organization, but it's got to be somebody who's strong enough to paint a vision, to translate that vision, and then to mobilize the business, because that's often the reason why innovation doesn't work, is the business is not mobilized.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Completely agree, Roddy. You need that capability, but I'm suggesting that, it's the combination of the more senior person who has the power with the more junior person who has the vision that is really going to drive that capability. But you need the ability to realize the opportunity, and that usually comes with seniority. But the ideation usually comes with somebody who's not, I'll use stuck in the past. But I don't mean that really. We all have our patterns of behavior, and sometimes we need new ideas, or, as Laura said, some external factor that comes into the organization that forces change. And I'm just hoping that sufficiently often it's going to be a young person with great ideas whom the organization has identified as somebody who's going to bring change to the organization. Okay?
Now, Mike wanted us to talk a little bit about talent, and, I'm extremely frustrated with what's out in the market to build talent. I think the APICS and the CSCMP classes teach traditional techniques, and, people struggle with, what is blockchain and what is a rules-based ontology and how do I think about open source code and Hadoop and, what are the opportunities? And that's why I really just said, I guess I need to build something. So we've built on social collaborative learning a platform which allows companies to take these next generation concepts and either build internal cohorts or join our next generation academy, which will actually take people across companies to ideate on these concepts, so that we'll have one in Europe and one in North America where people can put 3 individuals into the class for a cohort over a period of time. Now, Roddy, I know you helped us with this program. Anything you'd like to say here about talent and building next generation talent, either about this program or other things you've seen in the market?
Yeah, we keep missing the boat. I think there was this mad flurry of activity 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I think, all of us were part of it that said, we're not making enough data scientists. Well, if you read some of the reports on data scientists, the demand is leveling off. But what we don't have is we don't have enough architects and analysts that can go and take the Internet of Things data and start doing something with it. So I think that, once again, we're in the situation where, and unfortunately the cycle time for universities to bring these new skills to market is much longer than what we would hope. But I do think that, there are opportunities like postgraduate degrees, even the diploma concepts where we take existing technical people and take them through much shorter cycle talent development where we teach them specialist skills. We've just got to get faster and better at retooling the workforce for where I think we're going in the future. And I think that the universities are just too slow and too top-heavy to be able to do that efficiently and quickly.
Trevor, your thoughts? How do we build next-generation talent?
Yeah, there's always this balance between, core capabilities and, let's give a nod towards some of these other organizations that kind of build that foundation. But I think they document in the past. They're not defining the future. And I think a lot of what you're looking at, Laura, is defining the future. And, it's getting ahead of the game. I think this is really where we're sorely lacking in terms of standard capabilities. And to Roddy's point, I wish the universities would be more proactive in this space, but they tend to be a little bit backward-looking, in my opinion, in many cases. So I think a coalition such as you building, I think, is a really important initiative in driving forward-leaning thinkers in the supply chain space.
Well, thanks very much. And guys, thanks for joining us for our panel. Follow us online. We give all of our research away. We are deliberately trying to build a guiding coalition to jumpstart supply chain capabilities. And hopefully we'll see you at the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit. It'll be in Georgia this year, a little bit northeast of Atlanta. And we want to help everyone to be able to seize the opportunity in next generation thinking. Thanks, guys, and Allison, back to you.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks to our panelists and everyone who had joined us today. Just a few things to wrap up the webinar. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to send out the slides and the recording link to everyone, so keep an eye out in your email from that follow-up email from us. We also encourage you, as Laura mentioned, to engage with us on social media, so join us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or SlideShare to get information from us, as well as our newsletter, because we're sending that out once a month with all kinds of information about research and events and ongoing happenings in supply chain. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today, and if you have any questions, do reach out to us, because we're here to help you improve the performance of your operations. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Please stand by.